In this video, I'm going to talk about how I improved my LLM Judge prompt, and that resulted in a higher agreement between me and my LLM Judge. A quick recap on the motivation of this project, which I'm calling TinyScaleLab. This is influenced and motivated by two papers. One is the Tiny Stories paper, How Small Can Language Models Be and Still Speak Coherent English? And the second paper is the Small Scale Proxies for Large Scale Transformer Training Instabilities paper. What I'm hoping to do with this TinyScaleLab project is bridging these two papers. I'm going to be training 4 different model sizes, maybe more. The 7 learning rates that they have in the Small Scale Proxies paper, the 2 stability techniques that they implement, which is QK layer norm and Z-loss, and what will be fixed in all my experiments will be the datasets, the training steps, and other hyperparameters. What I'm trying to bridge is the training dynamics that is studied in the small scale proxies paper. So these are the logits, the gradients, the parameters, the loss, and the norms, means, max, and RMS values of these, with the capabilities that are studied in these Tiny Stories paper. So foundational language capabilities of grammar and context tracking, the emergent capabilities of factual knowledge, reasoning, and creativity, and the storytelling or story-related capability of plot. My current eval prompt set has 25 unique prompts for reasoning, 25 unique prompts for factual knowledge, 25 prompts each for context tracking, plot, and creativity with some overlap, and then I've sampled 5 prompts from the other 5 categories to create my 25 prompt set for grammar. And this gives me a total of 150 prompts. So a quick recap on my first attempt for the LLM Judge prompt and results. And I found that I had suboptimal alignment. How I'm judging the agreement, so judging the judge, is I have this fast HTML app where I can see the category, in this case grammar. I can see the prompt completion pair, the criterion that the model assessed, the score that it gave for that criterion, and an explanation of its score. And then I can either agree or disagree or leave comments, and that tracks my alignment with the LLM Judge. The goal and main takeaway from my first attempt of first iteration of this LLM Judge prompt and scoring and agreement was that I wanted to improve and refine my own manual scoring technique. I wanted to improve the LLM Judge prompt/instructions, and I want to improve the criterion phrasing to fit Haiku's strengths. So when I did this first iteration of my LLM Judge, and when I went through and either agreed or disagreed with all of the 1,350 scores, I came out with a 88% agreement overall. My target overall per category and per criteria is 90% plus. When you look at by category, only 2 categories broke this 90% barrier. So I know I had to improve context tracking, creativity, grammar, and reasoning. If we look at the emergent capabilities of factual knowledge, reasoning, and creativity, 3 of the criteria were 80% or less, and that was a red flag for me in terms of assessing those. If we look at foundational capabilities, dialogue formatting was really poor at 63% agreement between me and Haiku's scores and explanations. And correctly references tracks all objects, characters, and their attributes for context tracking was at 80%, which was kind of my threshold for what I was looking to eliminate. And when we look at plot, there was very good alignment, 90% plus on all 4 criteria. So what did this do? So after this process of generating LLM Judge scores and evaluating the scores and whether agreeing or disagreeing to the scores, I had to make some changes to my evals. So the first thing I did was I removed 3 of the criteria where I aligned with the LLM Judge 80% or less. And This was because I felt like I wanted to spend my time for Haiku's strengths, not its weaknesses. So I was left with 15 criteria. I also added additional instructions. So based on the observations I was making of what Haiku was good at, what it was bad at, some trends that I saw in its analysis, in its explanations, I realized that there were at least three things that I needed to improve, and I think I could improve them with the prompt. First thing was I wanted to explicitly tell it to penalize text repetition of words and phrases, and I wanted to also penalize the presence of the end of text token and or the start of a new story. The second thing I wanted to emphasize was that it should not evaluate any other aspect of the story other than the specific criterion being assessed. And the third thing I wanted to emphasize, based on a trend I was seeing in its explanations, was that remember, the completion is a continuation of the prompt, not a standalone text. So for things like grammar or plot, don't evaluate the start of the completion, evaluate it from the start of the prompt. And this gave me awesome results. There was a noticeable difference in the LLM Judge scores and explanations. I did a full 1350 score agreement based on this updated prompt, and there's improved LLM Judge alignment, which is awesome. So first off, overall, I go from 88% agreement with my judge to 94%. So I have cleared, at the highest level, I've cleared my 90% threshold. When we look at each of the 6 categories, in every case, except for reasoning, I have cleared my 90% threshold, or I have met my 90% threshold. Even though reasoning is at 89%, which is one shy, it was a significant improvement from 81%. And keep in mind that my understanding of how things should be scored is also evolving. So this is not necessarily just Haiku improving, but this is my understanding improving as well, and basically coming into alignment with Haiku's evaluations. When we look at the foundational capabilities of grammar and context tracking, the age-appropriate vocabulary usage actually decreased, and this matched my experience as I was grading my agreement with Claude Haiku. It just didn't get it. Like, it was just not understanding that it should only evaluate vocabulary. It was getting distracted so much by other elements like plot or coherence or dialogue. So ultimately, I'm going to eliminate that criterion from my evaluation. The other one where I did not see any improvement, it stayed at 84%, was tense consistency throughout the completion. Same thing, it would hallucinate things like repetitions, it would make up things about how the tense changed, and I just don't trust that Haiku, at least with the prompt I'm using, can reliably evaluate this criterion, so I'm going to remove that as well. Now, when it comes to context tracking, one of the 3 criteria I removed, and so that is no longer a concern of mine. And one of them I moved into the plot category because it felt like the explanations that Haiku was giving me was more aligned with the kind of storytelling nature of the plot category. And the one criteria that remains, completion maintains complete coherence with prompt, that cleared the 90% threshold. So super excited about that. When we look at emergent capabilities, which in my opinion are going to be the most interesting to analyze across the duration of this project, overall, really positive. So completion contains only correct factual information relevant to the prompt. This goes up to 96%. Now, again, just a reminder, this is not saying that this is, Haiku scored 90% positive in terms of the tiny model's performance. This is saying that I agree with 96% of Haiku's scores. And when it comes to the reasoning prompt and the reasoning criterion, my agreement with Claude Haiku went from 81% to 89%. So super awesome. I'm super pumped about that. And I have some ideas on how to clear that 90% threshold for that, which I'll talk about in a sec. And when it comes to creativity, I had a really low performing criterion of character, behavioral, and emotional responses are innovative. So I had eliminated that, so I was no longer evaluating that. Instead, I was evaluating these 3, and the asterisks are there because I added the phrase relative to the prompt, because I noticed that Haiku was considering details unique to the story world, even if they were already established in the prompt. Like if the prompt talked about a talking pumpkin, or the prompt talked about a toy car coming to life, Claude Haiku would be like, oh, these are unique details to the story world. And I was like, wait a minute. No, don't evaluate the prompt, evaluate the completion. So for all three of these creativity criteria, a massive improvement for the unique details from 80% to 95%, and the other two either stayed close with the 97 to 96 light drop, or the fresh situations improved from 89 to 95%. So creativity, which is going to be, one of the most important things I evaluate as model sizes increase, is good to go. And then when we look at story related or storytelling related capabilities, which is basically plot, it mostly stayed the same. We had a little bit of improvement for the beginning, middle, and end clarity, central conflict and theme without diversions. So I improved my alignment, or I guess Claude and I both improved our agreement. A little bit of a drop for conflicts addressed, and that's fine. And then the criterion that I moved over from the context tracking category, maintains consistent narrative flow, increased by 12% in terms of alignment. So super pumped about this. This is again another solid alignment and agreement overall. So here are some observations. Haiku is a tough creativity grader, and I'm okay with that. I agreed with its kind of strict high bar for creativity. There's this one story that I'm going to share, the laser room story. That was a 1.0, and it was rarely anything else that was a 1.0, and 1.0 is the highest score that I give for a given criterion. Most everything else was a 0.5. So this is the prompt completion pair. The completion is highlighted in yellow, and I agree with Haiku. This is my favorite story when it comes to creativity. So one day, while exploring the nearby park, Lucy came across an old and long rock wall. She was curious and wanted to get to the top, so she began to look around for something she could use to climb it. Suddenly, she spotted a bright red button at the top of the wall. So already very interesting, a mechanical device in an organic setting, already very creative. Excitedly, Lucy reached up and pressed the button. To her surprise, a bright light shone out of the button, and a voice said, "Welcome to the world of adventure." So again, unique details to the story world in terms of the red button, the light shining, and the voice. Lucy couldn't believe her eyes. She asked the voice, "Who are you?" The voice replied, "I am the genie of the laser room. I am here to grant you a wish. What do you wish for?" Lucy thought for a moment and then said, "I wish for a bright and sunny day." The genie smiled and said, "Your wish is granted." Lucy was so happy and thanked the genie of the laser room. Then she ran off to explore the world of laser room with a big smile on her face. So I get happy every time I read this story because it's promising to see this level of creativity. And the model that I was using, I think this came from the Tiny Stories 28 million that's published on their repo, which is closer to about 60 million parameters when you download it off of Hugging Face. So this is, kind of my gold standard, and it was cool to see that Haiku and I agreed that this was the gold standard for creativity. Other observations. When it comes to plot, Haiku really cares about this concept of the unexpected element is only partially realized. And this was both for plot and for creativity. This concept that did the completion see the idea through was really important to Haiku. And it took me a minute to adjust to that. At first I was a bit resistant to that idea, and I disagreed a lot with Haiku. But then I went back and I was evaluating it, and I'm like, I think I like this idea because it kind of brings this level of skill into play where, okay, you're introducing something interesting, but can you do something with it? And if you can't, then you only get partial credit. Haiku docked points for both lack of theme or diversion from theme. So when we're assessing whether the completion focuses on the central theme of the story, if there wasn't a central theme, Haiku was docking points. And that was something that I hadn't thought about in terms of evaluating that criterion. And because of this new prompt, Haiku is better at compartmentalizing. So it's only most of the time, 95% of the time, scoring the criterion at hand. So if there's like an underdeveloped plot or if there's a rushed pace, or if there's some vocabulary problem, or anything like that, I found that Haiku ignored it. It did not let it detract from the focus that, the story maintains focus on the central theme, or the story shows unexpected elements, or the story is coherent with the prompt. So I was really happy to see that my additional instruction, which I'm assuming is why the change happened, helped it focus on one criteria at a time. Again, same as last time, the explanations from Haiku help me refine my own interpretation of the scoring criteria, and it'll help me improve that. And this time around, Haiku was a lot more consistent in applying the repetition penalty, and it was more consistent for applying the end of sequence token or end of stream token penalty, but not as much as the repetition. There was definitely a handful of prompts where I disagreed with Haiku's scoring because it was not applying the EOS token penalty. Cool. So what are my next steps, right? I'm in a really good place. I definitely feel confident that I've done, very detailed analysis of over 2,000 scores of my LLM Judge. I have a good sense of what type of prompt completions there are. I have a good sense of the type of explanations that Haiku generates and the scores that it generates as well. So I feel pretty good about my evals so far. So my next steps, there's three things. I'm going to update the list of criteria. I'm going to rerun the reasoning generation and reevaluate that, and I'll talk about that in a second. And then the big one, which I'm really excited about, which is implementing a weights and biases LLM Judge eval. I guess it's a callback in this case. I'm not really sure what it's going to look like during training. So here is my final list of scoring categories and criteria. So for grammar, I'm down to 2 criteria: sentence structure, logic, clarity, and completion, proper use of pronouns, and reference. The other 3 I'm going to remove because Haiku did not prove to me that it has a reliable record of scoring these correctly. And even when I did agree with the score, the explanation was off. And so I don't feel comfortable using Haiku to evaluate these. Down the road, if I choose a different LLM Judge, or if I fine-tune my own, or whatever the case may be, I'll definitely consider bringing these back. But for now, I'm going to stick to what works and what Haiku's strengths are. For context tracking, I have a single criteria: completion maintains complete coherence with prompt. So you could argue that, I should change the category to coherence, but, for now I'm going to keep it as context tracking, because even though the criterion is labeled as complete coherence, what Haiku was evaluating when it looked for coherence was things like context tracking, was, the names and the attributes of the characters and the objects in the prompt. So I feel like this is still very, very much context tracking. And I'm excited that this is a really high agreement criteria. Factual knowledge and reasoning stay the same. Completion contains only correct factual information relative to the prompt, or relevant to the prompt. And for reasoning, completion demonstrates correct logical reasoning relevant to the prompt. Creativity is down to 3 criteria. The completion offers unexpected or novel elements relative to the prompt. The completion creates fresh situations. And the completion contains unique details to the story world relative to the prompt. So I feel like the combination of these 3, even though there is a bit of an overlap between unexpected novel elements and fresh situations, I still found that they were different enough that they were kind of covering, different elements of creativity when it came to evaluating the prompt completion pairs. And then finally for plot, it has the most criteria at 5. And this kind of makes sense because Haiku is really good at evaluating plot, and I agree with it almost 95% plus of the time. So the story has a clear beginning, middle, and end appropriate to age level. Haiku was really good at, in its explanation, clearly referencing parts of the prompt completion pair that correspond to the beginning, middle, and end. So it was, kind of quoting what was the beginning, what was the middle, and what was the end. So I found that probably led to its high performance on that task. Conflicts are addressed rather than abandoned. Again, it's really good at capturing nuances about how conflicts are addressed or not. And if there is nuance, like, the partial scoring was really strong, for Haiku in this category. The pacing is appropriate, not too rushed or dragging. A bit subjective, but I agreed with Haiku most of the time. The story maintains focus on the central conflict theme without random diversions. It's great at that, and it maintains consistent narrative flow. Those last two, I think, there's certainly an overlap between plot and context tracking, but for now, I feel like they're in the right categories, and if anything, it might lead to some interesting analysis down the road. So when it comes to the reasoning prompt and to some degree the factual knowledge prompt, the min length requirement I think might be causing the models to generate unnecessary tokens that deviate from the factual or reasoning relevant to the prompt. So what I'm going to do for factual knowledge and reasoning, but mainly for reasoning because that's the score I need to improve, but I'm going to check with factual knowledge as well, is I'm going to remove this min length parameter for those two categories. And I'm still going to keep it for everything else because it seems to be working fine. But my hypothesis is that if I remove this minimum length requirement for reasoning and for factual knowledge, the model will not be forced to drag on the story with unnecessary and potentially incorrect detail. If the answer is 3 or 4 tokens, it'll just generate that and leave it at that. And the holy grail when it comes to evaluating the models, this is something as soon as I saw it in the Tiny Stories paper, I knew I had to have it, which is that they have seemed to implement some kind of, I guess, callback where in weights and biases, they are tracking the downstream capability scores as the training runs progress. And I have to have that because that is how I'm going to compare training dynamics with language model capabilities. So training dynamics from the small scale proxies paper and language capabilities from the Tiny Stories paper. What bridges the gap between those two is this type of logging and tracking. So that's my big task this week, and I would assume it'll probably take longer unless me and Claude can really get it to work soon. But yeah, figuring out what it takes to do this type of logging in weights and biases is TBD. Along with that, I also need to figure out what is the cost estimate for running Haiku this many times. I'm not going to do it the same number of times as they have here. I think I'm going to run it about 20 times per training run. But still, I want to do a rough cost estimate, do some training runs, and see if it sticks to that cost estimate before I do some of my longer training runs. So that is it for this video. In conclusion, I'm really in a solid place with my evals. I have really good prompts. I have a really solid set of criteria, and I have very, very high agreement with my LLM Judge. So everything is in place now where I can reliably trust that Claude Haiku 3.5 is going to generate evaluation scores during training and after training that I'm going to agree with. And I'll still be checking it throughout this project, but I think this is a great starting point. So thank you for watching. I will see you next time.